Thank you. Mr. White, before the adjournment, you were explaining how the supply chain management policies worked or were applicable to the procurement that you were investigating. Could you now deal in a little bit more detail with how these provisions were circumvented? The first was with regard to the cover quoting. Did you have any evidence of this cover quoting?
Yes, Chair. As I said before the lunch adjournment, the entities related in one way or another to Mr. Pandey, which included his mother's and wife's companies as well as his brother-in-law's company, were used to give the impression that independent quotes were being obtained from three parties. So if one looked at the documents cold within the police records, it would appear that three quotes were obtained. Whereas if you know the background to the entities and the fact that for all intents and purposes these were Mr. Pandey's alter ego and he effectively controlled all of them, and they actually operated out of the same premises, and the same person within those premises, which I will come to later, actually was preparing the quotes for all three entities, then one can see that the very essence of obtaining competitive quotes from the market was being circumvented. And Chair, it can't just be a coincidence that the person within the police that is requesting the quotes by chance chooses three companies that are linked to each other. It just, the statistics of that happening by accident is almost impossible.
Yes, so there were no other companies that sent their quotes. It was only entities linked to Mr. Pandey.
Correct, Chair.
And you must tell me if you deal with this later, but there is the question of what the process was of getting quotes. How was it possible, or how would they explain, whoever they were, the fact that all the time the entities were all linked to Mr. Pandey?
Chair, there is no explanation. It's impossible to explain it. The process that should be followed is they should identify suppliers from the police supplier database for the type of goods they are looking for, and then request those suppliers to quote. And Chair, what we can see is that these entities were new to the police procurement department. They were only registered at the end of November 2009. So it wasn't, and they were registered at the same time on the same day. So everyone knew they were Mr. Pandey's entities. And Chair, just to take it a step further, when the people from supply chain were dealing with queries relating to these entities, they spoke to one person relating to all the entities. So if they had a query about an invoice or delivery note, they spoke to one person, being Mr. Pandey's secretary stroke personal assistant.
And do you remember or recall what her name was?
Her name was Taslim Rahman, Rahman.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. White, if I might refer you to your report, Exhibit RR4A at page 234.
What page?
234, Chair.
234.
Yes.
Okay, don't be too far away from the mic.
Sorry, Chair.
Yes.
You refer in the middle of that page to a Walton's counter book, which you put inverted commas, Taslim Rahman record book. Could you please tell the Chair about this record book and how it was obtained?
Chair, that book, it's a normal black-covered exercise book like one would expect a school pupil to have. It's just called a Walton's Counter Book. On the front cover of it is written what I have in quotes there as Taslim Rahman record book is written on the cover. And Chair, that was effectively a book that in the inside of it one could determine that she recorded everything she was told to do. Many instances she refers to instructions she receives from Tushin, being the Christian name of Mr. Pandey, and she writes down what she did, and she also writes down dealings she had with people from the police, particularly Mr. Narayan Prasad, regarding orders or quotations or invoices relating to all the entities that I referred to before the lunch adjournment. Chair, also in that book, she records the prices in many instances that would be quoted for each of the entities. So she records effectively the cover quoting. And in some instances, we were able to trace those the records that she had written in that book to the actual ultimate orders that the police placed and that the Pandey-related entities ultimately supplied at the inflated prices. So this book, Chair, it's what people always wish they could find in an investigation of this nature, where someone writes down what they actually did. This is the first time for me in more than 20 years of investigating where it was actually found. And this was part of the records that were seized by the police when they did a search of Mr. Pandey's business premises.
Mr. White, from pages 236 onwards, you provide some examples of extracts from this book, and I'd like to take you to some of them and just ask your comment. If we could start on page 236, it's record 19110, and it says at the top, Tushin asked to redo quotes for the, I assume it FFG means the following, and then at the bottom, all must be done on B Company's Gold Coast, Overstated, and Follow-Tone. You see that?
I do, Chair. So, Chair, that maybe just to explain how I summarized in the report. So, Chair, when under document number, that 19110, Chair, every page of evidence that was seized by the police.
I'm sorry. 191 on page 236.
Yes, Chair, at the top left-hand corner.
19110, yes.
So, Chair, each page of documents that was seized by the police or subpoenaed by the police was given a unique reference. So that when we worked with the documents, if one wanted to go back to the original source document, it could be obtained in the evidence that the police were storing. So this book was given numbers. Every page of it was numbered. So this evidence that I'm referring to came from document 19110. And the way I summarized it for ease was I've typed up at the top of that box what Advocate Wenzel's just referred to is a typed version of the handwritten that was in the book, which is directly below that. So all the entries in this book were handwritten. I've just typed it to the best I could from deciphering the writing as to what it actually meant. Chair.
Okay. So the typing is, or at least intended to be a reflection of what is handwritten.
Correct, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
So, Chair, but what can be seen there is that Tushin, being Mr. Pandey, has asked to redo the quotes, and it's for video cameras, digital cameras, throw phones, GPS. So there's a variety of things, a flip chart board, a generator, and then the instruction, all must be done on 3 companies, Gold Coast, Overstated, Follow-Tone. I interpret that to mean, Chair, that they must do 3 quotes that are effectively going to be the cover quotes that are going to be used to supply to the police.
Could you comment on the record?
So, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
So when it says all must be done on 3 companies, Gold Coast, Bravostat, and Voluto, so you are saying this, you interpreted this as a request that quotes from these 3 companies be sent through.
Correct, Chair.
Okay.
Could you please comment on the next record, 19111?
So, Chair, this is a summary of a discussion that I interpret her to have had with a gentleman by the name of Tushin K. Makan, and this is relating to Garmin's, Chair, because the number 1410 is a type of Garmin, and the price that he had quoted her was 2,795 Rand. And she then writes at the bottom of the page, informed Tushin, he said to do quote 9,995 Rand. Chair, almost 4 times the price they're going to pay for it. And then she writes, done quotes. Now, Chair, if you're doing a quote for one item, for one supplier, it would be singular. So I would interpret that to again mean that they've done 3 quotes for the supply of this. And the police, if they'd gone to the supplier of the goods, they could have bought them for almost a quarter of the price that they ultimately would have been quoted.
If you might then please have regard to page 238, document 19119. Could you comment on that, please?
So, Chair, then on this, it appears that Mr. Panda has requested a breakdown for 3 of the companies as to which entities had won what bids. So for Gold Coast, she's recorded nothing. Then for Valetone, she's recorded 3 items where they were awarded it. And then for Bravostat, there's 7 items where they were awarded it. Again, Chair, interesting to note, at no stage do any of those prices exceed 200,000 Rand. But again, just clear indication that a person working directly for Mr. Pandey has access to all 3 entities' records.
Then if you could turn to page 239 and document number 19120.
So, Chair, this one...
I'm sorry, what's the page number?
239.
Oh, okay.
Chair, it's at the top of that page. And it says, Tushin called to redo quotes for the following. Garmin GPS 1410 times 10 units should have 2 sets of quote. One Bravostat wins and the other Valetone wins. So again, you can see from their own records that they're keeping, that they're splitting as to which entity they want to win the order for the supply of the goods.
And then the same is repeated in 1921, if you could explain. It's on that same page, 239. This is for the video cameras.
Page 240.
239. It's
And what item?
document number 19120. This one now, so 11 referred to the quotes for the Garmin, and if you have a look at 12, this one is quotes for the video cameras, and the same kind of instruction. Do the quotes the same, 2 sets, one time Valetone wins and one time Bravostat. And
Good.
then for the digital cameras, you'll see the same. Do the quotes the same, 2 sets, one time Valetone, one time Bravostat wins. Gold Coast, nothing.
Correct, Chair. There's pages and pages of examples in this book that are the same, where it's clearly being done on instruction, according to the book of Tushin, who I've interpreted to be Tushin Pandey. and that she's preparing these quotes and sending them through.
If you can go have a look at page 241 and document number 1929, there's reference there. It says, went to the SAPS to deliver the 45 bags, also dropped off the correct invoices for the digital and video cameras with Ashwin. He said they will sort out. Who's Ashwin?
Chair, Ashwin was the Christian name of Captain Ryan Passat. So he's referred...
And who was that?
So he was the person who was in the supply chain that prepared the submissions of the 3 documents that then went to Colonel Madhu to authorize.
Within SAPS?
SAPS in the Supply Chain Management Department in Durban.
Okay.
So, Chair, he's referred to throughout documents as Ashwin or as Ash, A-S-H.
And then if you can comment on the document number 19143, further down on that page 241.
Again, Chair, this is where a quote's been done on the Overstated letter, and she's informed Tushin, and again it's done and sent to Captain Ashwin by email as well as fax.
And also said to change the price.
Correct, Chair. So, Chair, if one looks at the timing when these things are happening over that 6-month period, this is the same time period when these police officials are receiving gifts from Mr. Pillai.
If you could have regard to page 244, document number 19151, if you could just refer to that.
Chair, this is, based on what I could read in the book and determine, these entities had started using a new accounting system called Pastel, and she was attempting to capture these into this accounting system. But again, it's just clear that she's doing Bravostat as well as Valetone, and when she needed numbers, she just made them up if the reference numbers, etc., didn't work in the system. But again, it's just an indication of both entities.
Well, do you want to read into the record the writing on that appears against 19151?
Yes, Chair, it reads, I then tried to capture the invoices for Bravostat as well as Valetone, and I needed a supply invoice number. I made up numbers.
So this is Mr. Pandey's PA.
Correct, Chair.
Who has put this in her own handwriting.
Correct, Chair.
Is that right?
Correct.
And she's recording what she did.
Correct, Chair.
She says she tried to capture the invoices for Bravostat as well as Valetone.
Correct.
So for 2 of those entities that you told me about earlier.
Correct, Chair.
So she was trying to do invoices for them. And she needed a supplier invoice number, and she made it up.
Correct, Chair.
Maybe she suspected that she might need a record to show that she was instructed to do these things.
Chair, I think from our reading of this book, it appeared just to be, she kept a detailed record of everything she was told.
Yes,
so
it's very unusual, unless you want to make sure that there is a record.
Chair, my report, I didn't speculate as to why she did it. I just summarized.
No, I understand. I mean, to write down that she just made up the number. It's like she wants to either produce this somewhere at some stage, or she wants to make sure that she can show that she was instructed and this is how she was operating.
Chair, reading the book, it's very clearly indicates that. And Chair, as I said, in more than 20 years of doing investigations of this nature, this
You've
is
never
a
come across.
first for me.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
If you might just read one further entry on page 245, document number 19165 into the record and comment.
It says, called Shamila. She was another person that worked in the procurement at the police. Captain Ash has gone to the Commissioner's office, but she can help me with the invoices that she requires. 1, flip chart, 2,000 Rand each, 4,000 Rand Gold Coast plus invoice. 2 generators, 10 kVR Yamaha. Bravostat, 1 times 92,500. 1 times 91,000. Velotone, 1 times 91,050. 1 times 90,000. Gold Coast, 1 times 93,250. Resubmitted new invoices for the above. Digital camera, Bravostat invoice 1021, 97,500. Velotone, no invoice for GPS 1410, brackets 10 times 100,000. Gold Coast invoice number 10067, make it the generator. Done all the above, called Captain Ash, he has received everything is fine. Shamila is just capturing all the 2010 equipment. Once she's done, she will do all the tactical work. Inform Tushin as to what Captain Ashwin requires. So again, Chair, and I mean, those generators that are referred to there at just around 90,000, to my recollection, were costing about 5,000 Rand each.
Yes, I think one of the witnesses, I think Colonel van Lochenberg, did say that, for example, there would be a generator that costs about 4,000 Rand, but it gets, SAPS gets charged, I think, somewhere in the region of 90,000 Rand.
Correct, Chair.
Yeah, yes.
And then there's an interesting entry on page 252. And I'm referring to document number 19210. If you could read that into the record, please.
It says, came in, sorted out Captain Ashwin booking at, Captain Ashwin booking with Corin at Protea R/Bay, which I've interpreted to be Richards Bay, informed Tushin. Chair, that entry in the book is dated the 31st of March 2010, and we subsequently could identify that that was a booking made and paid for by Tushin Pandey for Captain Ashwin Narain Prasad to stay at the Protea Hotel in Richards Bay. And when I talk about the benefits that they received, this is one of the ones.
I'm sorry. The last page I had was we were going to 252. Is that where we still are?
Yes, Chair.
Chair, it's...
and which number?
It's document number 19210.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Chair, it's the second from the bottom of the page.
Yes, okay. So you say you established that related to a booking basically for Captain, what's his name again?
Narain Prasad.
Yes, which was to be paid for by either Mr. Pandey or one of his entities.
Correct, Chair, and we subsequently could trace that back to the booking. It was confirmed by an official from the Protea Hotel in Richards Bay that Captain Narain Prasad had stayed there. The police obtained a statement from the manager of the hotel with all the supporting documents, and the payment for the stay could ultimately be traced back to Panda-related bank accounts or credit cards.
Now, Mr. White, we've seen that cover quoting in this respect, particularly when there were only 3 companies which you controlled yourself who were quoting and competing against each other, what are the most important impact that would have on the budget of the South African Police Services?
Chair, the simple answer is the police will pay significantly above the market-related price for the goods they purchase. And as a result, money that, in these instances, we can see in many instances they paid 3 times the price. Chair, I'll refer to the summary later, but out of 12 million rand they spent, by way of example, the goods actually only cost Panda 4 million. So the police effectively wasted 8 million rand that they got no benefit for.
Now, apart from the cover quoting, what was another method used by Mr. Pandey to circumvent the supply management procedures and precepts?
So, Chair, I had briefly referred to it earlier, and that's where they split the order. So again, that's just to keep the level of authority within the approval limits of, in this instance, Colonel Madu. So that was where they split it to keep it below the 200,000 rand limit. The other benefit of that is it allows them to get quotes and not have to go out to tender.
And for the accommodation that was provided,
so, Chair, the other method that's used, not only by these entities, but in a lot of government procurement, is to justify the purchase as an emergency or as an urgent procurement. Because if they... Sorry, Chair.
I'm sorry. Before you go there, going back to Captain, the captain's booking, did you get to know how long he stayed in that hotel in Richards Bay and what the reason why, whether he was on holiday or what the story was?
So, Chair, I will...
In terms of the investigation.
Yes, Chair, we did. I'll come to the detail later on some of the payments that were made to the officials.
Yes.
But by way of example, the one that clearly sticks in my mind is the stay at the Carradine Hotel, also a Protea Hotel, was for Valentine's Day. It was the 14th of February.
Yes.
So those were, it appears that these were all holiday stays. The stays for Colonel Madu and his family was a trip to Cape Town, air tickets and accommodation. So they appear to have been of a vacation nature.
Okay.
what was the, you've dealt with the splitting of invoices to make sure that the amount is less than the 200,000 cutoff level. Where there were large amounts, as in the case of the accommodation provided, what were the procedures that were required, particularly if there was an amount more than 20 million or 30 million, as in the case of accommodation?
So, Chair, in the instance of the accommodation, they should have gone out to tender. But what was done in the lead up to the World Cup, as well as for the World Cup, the police officials in the supply chain management department justified the procurements as urgent or as an emergency. Chair, and as a result, they never even got 3 quotes. They got 1 quote and appointed that entity. That entity was Gold Coast. Now, there's motivations written. In most instances, those motivations, if one just looks at them slightly critically, make no sense at all. So, by way of example, one of the bookings that was done was for a training event where police officials, that was in early 2010 needed to come to Marion Hill, which is just outside of Durban, for a week's training. That accommodation was only booked on the Friday. People didn't decide on Friday we're going to have 30 members in Marion Hill from Sunday night for a week's training. But it was booked at the very last moment, and one must remember that Gold Coast, Mr. Pandey's entity, didn't own any hotels or any buildings. They sourced them from other suppliers. So that's one where they justified as an urgent procurement, but it's just either poor planning or, from what it appears, it was done intentionally to leave it to the last minute. The other ones are accommodation throughout KwaZulu-Natal where police members, for one reason or another, needed to stay in certain areas. So at the time there was some municipal unrest in some areas, there was some taxi violence in other areas, and they needed members to stay in these different areas. What was done is a first booking for 2 or 3 days was done on the basis that it's urgent and it's an emergency. A booking would be done, and that booking would then be extended on a week-by-week basis, relying on the original motivation for sometimes in excess of a month. So again, never going to the out to the market to obtain quotes to see whether this was a fair price. And in that regard, so that happened in the lead up to the World Cup, and then a similar sort of motivation was used when making the significant procurement that related to the accommodation in the month around the World Cup. And Chair, in that instance, the police, and in the minutes of their various meetings, you could see that some 8 months before that, knew they needed accommodation for their members that would be stationed in Durban or in the month of the World Cup. They were backwards and forwards saying it's a national responsibility to provide the accommodation. But in late 2009, we can see that some suppliers were asked to provide quotations. The records that have been written by the police say that there was no response out of the 10 from, I think, 8 of the suppliers. One said they had no accommodation, and Gold Coast said they had accommodation. The police interviewed those different suppliers or potential suppliers, where the supplier said no accommodation available or no response. So particularly the ones that said no response. Those suppliers, when interviewed, said they were never asked to quote. But then what happened was, when the procurement was ultimately done, 80% of the total amount to be booked was booked with Gold Coast.
Perhaps before we deal, because you're touching on it now, before I deal in more detail with the rules regarding emergency procurement, could you tell the Chair about the Coastlands Hotel?
So, Chair, the Coastlands Group is a Durban-based group that owns more than one hotel in Durban. They said they were never asked in 2009 to provide a quotation. They then, to my recollection, were asked in April and May of 2010. They provided quotations to the police. They said how many rooms they had available. And because it was an extended period of time, they almost reserved those rooms, although they didn't have an official order for the police. The price they were quoting was in the region of 400 Rand a night per person. When they ultimately received an order from the police for accommodation, because they were the ones, Gold Coast received 80%, Coastlands got 16%, and then another small supplier got 4%. When they received the order, it was for significantly less than the number of rooms they told the police they had available. Now, the fact is they were supplying the rooms in the region of 400 Rand a night, and Gold Coast were quoting 850 rand a night, almost double the price. What then happened is, because Mr. Pandey didn't have rooms, he had to source rooms even though he had the order. One of the suppliers he used to supply him as a conduit to supply the police was Coastlands. He had gone back to Coastlands and told them that because he was only getting around 400 rand a night, he then negotiated a rate from them of 350 rand a night per person sharing, and then billed the police just more than 900 rand a night. So the police could have done the same negotiation and bought the room for 350 rand. And Chair, it's thousands of nights. So ultimately there was more than 20,000 nights of accommodation booked through Gold Coast. And if everything's been charged double the price, one can see how quickly the prejudice to the police accumulates.
If we can then...
1 second. Yes.
If I can then refer you to page 171. And there you deal with part 5 of the Supply Chain Management Manual, which deals with urgent and emergency cases. Could you please explain to the Chair what the rules were with regard to this?
Chair, the police procurement procedures were no different from what one finds in most government departments, because these are linked back to the Public Finance Management Act and the regulations and guidelines that have been issued by National Treasury related to that. And Chair, it's where, and urgent and emergency cases are sort of almost used interchangeably, the terminology. But what it does say is that the supply of the goods is of critical importance, and that there must, people's effectively lives are in danger, and that if it's not procured urgently, then these people are in danger and their lives can be affected. So, Chair, an example would be if there was flood damage and a hospital's roof was blown off. One would see that's an emergency. You would need to fix it urgently because the hospital can't operate and patients are exposed to the elements. So those are the kind of things that my understanding are justified in this basis. But here is a accommodation for an event that in South Africa we had known about for years and years before. We had built stadiums, but the police couldn't manage to procure accommodation until the month before the event. Chair, what it also sets out is that you can't use bad planning or the lack of proper planning as a requirement to justify an urgent procurement and for circumventing the procurement requirements as a result.
Mr. White, from your investigations, were there meetings held regarding the accommodation? And what transpired at those meetings?
Yes, Chair, those were the meetings that I said, I referred to earlier, that go back some 8 months, so towards the end of 2009, where it's being discussed at regional planning meetings within KZN, that there's going to be additional members from other provinces brought to KZN. They will be staying in Durban and they will need to be accommodated. And that just keeps getting deferred. A number of the inputs into those meetings are from Colonel Madhu, again, person who's ultimately responsible for some of this procurement, for inserting Gold Coast into the equation, and the person who was receiving benefits for himself and his family from Mr. Pandey.
And it's correct, he was saying when he was asked, he's still waiting for feedback from head office.
Correct, Chair. And then it gets to the very last moment, and they do a motivation to head office to approve the procurement on the basis that it's now an emergency.
Mr. White, if we can then have a look at the submission made by Major General Pillai.
1 second. Thank you. Continue.
If we can then have a look at the submission signed off by Major General Pillai, which you deal with on pages 217 to 224 of your affidavit.
I'm sorry. Where do you want us to?
Page 217.
Of Exhibit RR4A.
Yes, RRA. 4A.
RR4A.
Yes. Sorry,
Page
Chair.
227.
217.
217.
Chair. Yes.
Yes.
Mr. White, you deal with this extensively in your report all the way up to page 230. If you wouldn't mind explaining and providing your comments to the Chair with regard to the submissions made motivating urgency or an emergency in this case.
So, Chair, this document was a document that was submitted to the National Bid Adjudication Committee of the Police. It was dated the 4th of June 2010. If one recalls, Chair, that's about a month before the World Cup started. Chair, and this motivation was to obtain approval to deviate from normal bidding procedures by finalising the above-mentioned requirement on a quotation basis in terms of paragraph 16A6.4 of the Treasury Regulations issue in terms of the PFMA on an urgent basis. Chair, as I've already indicated, this was known well in advance. If there was a motivation to be done now, the basis for not following procurement process would not be that it was an emergency. It would have to be justified that they didn't plan properly and they now need to, they don't have time to go out for tenders. Chair, but the submission...
Well, I guess on what you have already told me, they did plan, but they planned to beat the system.
Chair, that's 100% correct.
Yeah.
Because prior to this, they'd already obtained quotes from Coastlands and
Yes.
Gold Coast in April and May.
Yes.
So they'd already identified who they were going to
Yes.
use.
Okay.
But Chair, paragraph 3 of this submission, which I referred to at the bottom of page 217, paragraph 13.025, it states, due to the short period between now and the indicated dates on which the accommodation is required, as well as the fact that the accommodation must not be known to the public, it is impossible to advertise a bid in this regard. Chair, I agree there was a short period, which was of their own making. But Chair, the part that makes absolutely no sense to me is the fact that part of this motivation, which was signed off, Major General Pillai as well, was that they didn't want the public to know where the police were staying during the World Cup for safety reasons. Later on they referred to it as for safety reasons. Chair, advertising to say, please, to potential suppliers, can you provide accommodation and at what price? In no way does that tell the public where the police will actually be staying. So Chair, it's just, and this is signed off by numerous people, this, of which Major General Oris Pillai was the last person to sign off. But Chair, if he had applied his mind in any way, he would have said, this motivation cannot make any sense. But that just shows the lengths that were gone to try and justify the basis for an emergency, because they actually didn't have a basis.
And if I could just refer you to page 219.
So, Chair, the top of that page in paragraph 13.030, I've taken an extract of what Major General R.S. Pillai's authorization at the end of this document said. And he, in handwriting, which I've assumed to be his, is stated, certified as being urgent and based on safety and security of the members of the SAPS. There's then a signature that says logistics, SWC, which I've interpreted to be Soccer World Cup. And then there's a stamp that says R.S. Pillai, Major General. So, Chair, it's not like he signed without reading what was put before him. He's actually said it's because of the safety.
He wrote it himself.
Yeah, which doesn't make sense, Chair. It's not a basis for circumventing the procedures.
And then if I can just point out on page 221, in the middle paragraph, it's 13.035. You point out there that the police were discussing accommodation of police members during the Soccer World Cup as early as March 2009.
That's correct, Chair. That was in a committee that they called Section 4 committee, which was around the planning that related to the World Cup. And yes, Chair, it's more than a year prior to the World Cup. They were already talking about the accommodation. And that was a monthly meeting, and it was a standing item on the agenda. But it took them until the June to actually put the motivation for the tender waiver to the bid adjudication committee.
Now, you've touched on the benefits that were received by people associated with the procurement process, and you summarize this in your affidavit on page 21, signed back in your affidavit, not in your report. Could you please explain to the Chair the footnotes that you've included under that table, and also for record purposes indicate what the value of the benefit was?
What did you say the page is on the affidavit?
21, Chair.
Okay. Yes.
So, Chair, that table is an extract from my report, and I've summarized the payments that were made for the benefit of various police officials. In line 1, it's Madu, which was Colonel Madu. It was 89,104 Rand 95 cents. Chair, the footnote to that shows that there was Oyster Box 6,010 Rand, SA Airways 8,584 Rand, Advocate Cars 60,000 Rand, Western Grand Cape Town 14,510 Rand 95 cents. The second.
Just if you could just explain those as far as you understand each of those.
So, Chair, the Oyster Box was a stay for Colonel Madu and I assume his wife at the Oyster Box Hotel in Durban. It was for a weekend. It was paid for by Mr. Pandey's Diners Club card and the documents. And in each of these, Chair, the supplier of the goods or service was interviewed by the police. They provided statements, they provided all the supporting documents, how the order was made, how it was paid for, and where it was hotel accommodation, how the register where the various policemen signed in to stay, or any other slips that they signed while staying in the hotel. So they provided all that documentation. Chair, so based on that, I've got no doubt in my mind that these individuals received these benefits. Where it relates to the advocate cars, it was a car that was bought by Mr. Pandey for Colonel Madu. SA Airways was air tickets to Cape Town for Colonel Madu and his family.
I'm sorry, have I missed something? Have you explained what that advocate's cars, what's the reference to advocates?
Chair, it's just the name of the supplier.
Oh, that's the name of the supplier. Okay.
Yeah, Chair, it's got nothing to do with the legal profession.
Okay, all right.
And then the Western Grand Hotel was accommodation for Colonel Madu and his family in Cape Town. The second one was for Captain Narain Prasad, 59,662 Rand 71 cents. That's a total of a varsity college payment of 43,500 Rand. It was a payment made for one of Captain Narain Prasad's children to attend university. There's a payment to game stores of 7,154 Rand. So that was a treadmill that was bought by Mr. Pandey, and the delivery shows it as being delivered to Captain Narain Prasad's house. The Protea Hotel Caridine was a stay over to my recollection, it was for Captain Narain Prasad and his wife, and then the Protea Hotel Richards Bay that I referred to earlier, that was in the Secretary's book, where she confirmed she'd made the booking. That's 7,256 Rand. So then there's a payment for the benefit of Lieutenant General Ngobeni, being the Provincial Commissioner at the time, 20,962 Rand. This was a payment of 18,712 Rand to the Dish Restaurant in Umhlanga for her husband's birthday, as well as a payment of 2,250 Rand to the DJ that was booked and paid for also by Mr. Pandey for that event. And then the last payment is for Major General R.S. Pillai, 1,535 Rand 92 cents. Chair, that was for the hire of a vehicle at the Durban airport that was booked and paid for by Mr. Pandey's entities, and it was the use of that vehicle. The person whose name it was booked in and signed for it was R.S. Pillai.
Then, with regard to the surprise birthday party for General Nkobeni's husband, are you aware of any investigations that were carried out with regard to that? Was the restaurateur interviewed by police?
He was, Chair. He provided an affidavit as well as various supporting documents. That event was booked by Mr. Pandey. There was an initial payment of 10,000 Rand cash. The balance of the payment being 8,712 Rand was paid for using Mr. Pandey's credit card. And while he wasn't aware of whose birthday it was, he was told that Mr. Pandey wasn't attending, but it was the Brigadier's birthday. Lieutenant General Ngobeni's husband is a brigadier in the South African Police, and to my knowledge it's not disputed that it was her husband's birthday and that it was paid for by Mr. Pandey. In addition to that, the DJ that played the music and provided the microphone for the evening has also provided an affidavit, and he confirmed that it was Ngobeni's that attended the function together with some friends, and he was paid 2,250 Rand for attending the evening and providing the equipment.
And are you aware whether the restaurateur was approached to explain this, and who had paid for, who had booked the party and who had paid for the party, and what he said?
He was, Chair. He provided an affidavit together with the supporting documents showing the receipt of the 10,000 Rand cash that he dealt with Mr. Pandey. And he also explained, and I don't know why, But Mr. Panda asked him to give him an inflated invoice for a higher amount, which he then provided.
And I'm sorry, I missed who provided that affidavit?
The manager of the Dish restaurant, Chair.
Oh, okay.
So he provided all the documents relating to the booking and the payment and who attended. But he was also asked by Mr. Panda to provide an invoice for a higher amount. Chair, I can't see why he would ask for that. And the only reason I can think of is that Mr. Panda may have been wanting to tell the Provincial Commissioner that the birthday party cost more than it actually did.
Chair,
And it was inflated, or did he agree to inflate it?
Yes, Chair.
What was the correct amount that he should have included? What was the...
So, Chair, he should have included 18,712 Rand.
Yes.
But, Chair, an example, just if I could refer to it in RR4A at page 325.
Yes.
Chair, that's a copy of the what he called the inflated invoice that he had provided. Chair, at the top left-hand corner, you can see it's the Dish restaurant. The customer, in the middle just below that, the name is Mrs. B.M. Ngobeni. And then on the right-hand side, just below the heading tax invoice, we have invoice date, 30th of May 2010. And then we have job number, it says Mr. Pandey, and then it sets out the costs of what was billed. Chair, I have the number somewhere in the report, but if we total those up, it comes to 29,712 Rand. It's approximately 11,000 Rand more than it actually cost.
Yes, okay, thank you.
and Chair, just for your purposes, this issue is dealt with from page 322 of the affidavit. It's the Dish restaurant, and the restaurateur is a Mr. Freddie Singh.
Chair, maybe just to refer back, I said that of the 18,000 Rand, 10,000 Rand was paid in cash and the balance using a credit card. And Chair, just on page 324, so the page prior to the one we're currently at, is an extract of Mr. Pandey's credit card. And then in the middle, in that red box, we can see Dish Umhlanga Ridge, 8,712 Rand. So those were the documents that we could find to confirm, one, what the people said, but as well as documentation to support how it was paid for, etc. Chair, and one just needs to remember that around the same time of this is when the Provincial Commissioner was telling Brigadier Kemp and General Boyson to stop the investigation into this procurement.
Yes.
Perhaps that you've mentioned this now, and before dealing with this, with Major General Nkobeni further, which I will do. You prepared a timeline, and next to your report, it's Annexure TSW3 on page 514. It's in bundle B.
Exhibit RR4D.
B, Chair.
B for Beatrice.
B for Beatrice.
Okay. What page?
514, Chair.
Yes.
Chair, effectively that,
Chair, I'm just sorry, I noticed that the gentleman who is supposed to be doing our overhead slides, I don't see him.
There is somebody who normally keeps an eye on them, and they communicate with him if there is a problem. Did he indicate that there was a problem?
Well, not to me, Chair. He was here this morning.
You realize he is not there?
Yes, I'm turning. I think this is where he sits, Chair.
Oh,
I think that's his
okay.
computer. Perhaps he's just gone to for a comfort break. But we can continue.
Let's continue because we have not been told there's a problem.
Yes.
And yeah, okay.
Thank you. Now, here, the heading of the document is relationship between significant events and the benefits to the South African Police Services personnel. Could you briefly take the Chair through this document?
So, Chair, that document is effectively a timeline on which I've inserted the dates on which the various benefits were procured for the different police officials. So if one, and the colours on the diagram, Chair, the different colours relate to different police officials. So at the very bottom of the page, I have a key where pink relates to the Provincial Commissioner Ngobeni, green relates to Captain Reinpersad, red for Colonel Madu, and blue for RS Pillai. Chair, what one can see, if one just looks at the bottom of that page, so below the yellow line in the middle, the first entry I have is on about in the middle of the page, and it's the oyster box accommodation for Colonel Madu. It's the 14th and 15th of November. So that is effectively right at the beginning of this procurement process. That is just before Colonel Madu assisted Pandey in having his wife and mother's entities registered on the police supply database at the 30th of November. So 2 weeks before that, there's a stay at probably one of the most elite hotels in Durban and Umhlanga for Colonel Madu. Chair, it then continues, and one can see that fairly consistently across that page, through to the last one on the bottom right, is the dish restaurant for the Provincial Commissioner, that benefit, which was on the 29th of May 2010. So it's right through the procurement process leading up to the World Cup. And Chair, at the top of the page, if one just looks at the pink items, so the first pink line may be a bit difficult to see, Chair, but it's dated the 5th of May 2010, and that was the first date that, according to Brigadier Kemp, he was instructed by PC Ngobeni to stop the investigation into the procurement process at SEM. So that's on the 5th of May, according to Brigadier Kemp, some 3 and a bit weeks prior to the benefit of the birthday party. And then there's ongoing dates which I've extracted from various affidavits, where on the 8th of May, Major General Boyson was also told to stop the investigation. So, Chair, this just, and the purpose of this was in anticipation of testifying in a criminal trial to be able to show, when referring to dates, when a benefit was received, and it was throughout the period that people in supply chain management were receiving benefits, or were in a position to be able to stop the investigation, being the Provincial Commissioner, they were receiving benefits right around the time they took various actions.
Mr. White, would you mind dealing also with
Just wish the writing on TSW3 was bigger than it is. But maybe that can be sorted out later, maybe not.
Chair,
It would help.
prepare another copy with bigger writing, Chair.
Oh, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. White, if you could just also deal with the entry date, the 10th of May 2010, also in the pink at the top of the page.
Chair, that was again from Major General Boyson. We received that information where I've stated here that PC Ngobeni stated direct lines with head office in request for certain information should be terminated. Boyson again told to stop the investigation.
Yes.
Chair, Mr. White deals with these affidavits upon which he relies here in his report at page 327, starting at paragraph 15.077. I don't know if it's necessary to go to those affidavits unless you would like me to take you there.
Well, if it just confirms what he has already said, we don't need to.
Yes.
You have indicated for the record where it is to be found.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Now, we know that Mr. Pandey has made several millions of rands profit from these transactions. And relatively speaking, in particular with regard to Major General Pillai, the amounts paid the amount paid to him is small. It's 1,500 rand for a car hire. In that respect, I would like to refer you to a money flow chart prepared by you. It's Annexure TSW2. It's Exhibit RR4B for Betty at page 512.
Chair, this diagram is effectively summarizes the flow of the money that was either paid by the police or, to the extent I could determine what was done by it, by Mr. Pandey's entities. Chair, I apologize again, it's quite small, but quite difficult to fit the information onto one page. Chair, on the very left, in blue, we have the SAPS, and then flowing from that, if one moves to the right, I've summarized all the payments that were made to the different Pandey entities. So if one adds those all up, if we look at the bottom, just below, between the blue and the yellow boxes, is an amount of 47,346,597 rand. The last number on the left-hand side of the page. So that was the total amount that was paid by the police to the various Pandey entities.
Over a period of 10 months.
Yes.
More or less, November
even maybe just
2009 to
August 2010.
2010.
Yeah, so approximately 2 months.
Yeah.
So 10 months. Chair, that then, to the extent I could, tracked the flows of the money. I don't summarize on here payments to suppliers, but what I can show, Chair, is that the blue lines, just to the right of those yellow boxes, are monies that have flowed between the different Pandey entities, just to refer to them colloquially as that. And it's, Chair, it's millions of rands. It's not like it was a small payment. So those are monies that flow from the entities down the bottom, predominantly up to Gold Coast. Chair, there's then significant payments that come out of Gold Coast and flow to various bank accounts controlled by Mr. Pandey or his wife. Chair, that would effectively mean that all those payments would be profits that have been made by the entity because they're not used to pay the suppliers.
The amounts that went to members of the SAPS leave out the money for the birthday party for the provincial commissioner's husband. The other people, is that based on tracing the amounts that were paid from these entities into their bank accounts, or how was that established?
So, Chair, those payments were always to suppliers. So the police officials weren't paid in cash.
Yes.
So that, Chair, if one looks at the far right of this diagram, we have the police officials, as in Pillai, Madhu and Narain Prasad. And if one works backwards, we can then trace where the payments actually came from, which bank accounts of Mr. Pandey's were used to pay the suppliers for the benefits that the police officials received. And we can then trace that money back to show that it originated with the police.
Yes, now what I'm asking is, how did you establish that they reached the police official concerned?
Well, Chair, in all instances, they bought them
Well, the one that was flown to Cape Town or Richards Bay or that stayed in a hotel, that I would understand. But I thought that part of this was just cash.
No, Chair, that amount there was no cash.
It's the monetary value of whatever benefit was given to them.
Correct.
Whether it's a trip or a trade meal or anything like that.
Car or university education.
Okay.
So this was actual benefits.
Yes.
So, Chair, what did happen and because one looks at the amounts that were paid to the police officials and one says it's less than 200,000 Rand and the total procurement was 47 million. It looks very small. But, Chair, what did happen in this process, if one looks at that diagram in the middle at the bottom of the page, there's three amounts that refer to checks that were cashed. So Mr. Pandey cashed checks with a total value of 3.7 million Rand. I don't know what happened to that cash.
Okay. Would that have been at the same time or within a few days of each other?
It was over the period,
Yeah.
and it was all as a result of receiving money that was paid by the police. So some of that money was Gold Coast then wrote out cash checks and they cashed them.
Yes. Okay.
I don't know what happened to that cash.
Yes.
But for a business that's buying goods from approved suppliers, it doesn't make sense why Mr. Pandey would now need such a high amount of cash. In a period of 8 months, he had 3.7 million rands worth of cash.
Otherwise, he would have been transferring money from the accounts of these entities into his own accounts if he needed.
Chair, he'd already transferred well over 10 million Rand to his wife in his personal bank account. So in addition to that, there's 3.7 million cash.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. White, at page 508 of your report, it's Exhibit RR4A. You deal with the losses suffered by the SAPS and you postulate a number of scenarios if you wouldn't mind taking the chair through those scenarios.
What page do you say that is?
508, Chair.
508.
Yes, Chair.
And it's RR4A.
Yes, Chair.
Chair, because of the manner in which the procurement had been done and the way in which Mr. Pandey via Gold Coast invoiced the police, it wasn't possible in all instances to trace back a specific Gold Coast invoice back to an order, because the order was just a huge amount, or back to a specific supplier. But Chair, what I could do is I could determine instances where services were never provided, or I calculated the amount at which they were provided above the cost price. Chair, maybe just before, or maybe just to start with scenario 1, at the top of page 508. So that, and this only relates to the World Cup accommodation provided by Mr. Pandey and Gold Coast. So scenario 1 I've described as the calculation of the value of overstated invoices.
Overstated invoices, does that mean inflated?
Inflated, Chair.
Yes, okay.
So Chair, that amount of 4,968,775 Rand 47 cents, Chair, that is effectively where Gold Coast charged the police for 5,287 nights of accommodation when no police official was booked into the accommodation. So what they did, Chair, and I'll come back to explain a specific example. If Gold Coast paid for 20 nights, they billed the police for 23. They just inflated their invoice. And Chair, that number's been proved by going back to the suppliers to say, how many nights did Gold Coast buy from you? And when we track it back, we take the nights, their invoices, what they were paid by Gold Coast, and then take what Gold Coast billed the police. Chair, it sounds like it's impossible, but once again, Gold Coast actually kept a record of this, and they did it on purpose, Chair. And Chair, maybe, I think we missed this earlier, Chair, but if I could go to page...
It's 491.
Well, Chair, maybe just my affidavit, it's probably easier, Chair. It's at page 15 of my affidavit.
15 of your affidavit.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, I'm there.
So, Chair, this again comes back to the books that are prepared by Mr. Pandey's secretary, writing down what she does.
Yes.
There was a second book that related to the Soccer World Cup. And Chair, in that book, there's an example at the top of page 15 of one of the items that she's recorded. And this was prepared by a supplier of accommodation to Gold Coast. So we have a date column, we then have true stay, and then we have Gold Coast charge.
So it's like a true stay and false stay.
So Chair, true stay, we could trace back to the supplier of the accommodation, what they were actually paid.
Mm-hmm.
And then Gold Coast charge, we can trace back to the Gold Coast invoice to the police.
Yes.
So in that, on the 6th of June 2010, the true stay is 48 members, the Gold Coast charge is 60 members. So on that day, for that one supplier, they charged 12 extra nights. Chair, and the average...
Oh, this is what this means. So it means that the correct position is that 48 members stayed in whatever accommodation, but they charged for 60 members.
Correct, Chair.
And they write it down.
They write it down. And Chair, that was then traced back to all the documentation. So either to the Gold Coast invoice to the police, or to the different suppliers to Gold Coast of the accommodation. And once again, Chair, the police went and got affidavits from all these people and all their supporting documents.
Yes,
In some
yes.
instances, the number of nights that Gold Coast were charging for, the number of rooms, exceeded the size of some of these were small establishments, exceeded.
Yes.
So they built for rooms that just don't exist, never mind weren't booked for the police.
So they could say, for argument's sake, in Lodge A, on the 20th of January, or let's go to 2010, on the 6th of June 2010, 10 members stayed there, but only to find that when you go there, the lodge only has 5 rooms. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Correct, Chair. A better example may be to say it has 4 rooms,
Yes.
and even if there was 2 people per room, it only comes to 8, but they built for 10. Correct, Chair, and the owners of the different establishments have provided statements, affidavits to the police confirming exactly what they were paid for by Gold Coast based on the number of people that stayed there.
Yes, okay.
So, Chair, and it's quite a large analysis, but once that whole analysis is done, it shows that there's 5,287 nights that were charged to the police where no police member stayed in the accommodation.
Yes.
And Chair, what I did was I calculated an average price for all the accommodation, so based on the number of rooms compared to what Gold Coast charged, and the average price is R939.81. So that price multiplied by the 5,287 gives you your 4.9 million. So that was the first and probably most blatant amount. Chair, it's just didn't exist. So you billed for a service that wasn't provided. The second scenario, Chair, was where they overcharged based on the incorrect tariff. So when the order was given to Gold Coast and Gold Coast quoted, they said we will charge 850 Rand a night. They actually charged, as I said, on average 939 Rand a night. Chair, the difference between those two amounts multiplied by the accommodation provided, which is 22,548 nights, will give you the 2 million overcharge. So that 2 million is on page 508, scenario 2. So that 2 million is the difference in price between what Gold Coast quoted and the average price they charged. Chair, there's then the issue of how much was paid to Gold Coast as a result.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand these scenarios you have put in here. Scenario 1 is where it says calculation of the value of overstated invoices. It's just the total amount of inflated invoices. Is that right?
Correct.
And scenario 2, calculation of overcharge based on incorrect tariff used by Gold Coast Trading. The incorrect tariff would have been tariff provided that is supposed to have been provided by the supplier,
So
but the supplier provided them with the correct tariff, but they represent to the SAPS that the tariff was a higher one, when in fact that was not the case.
Not quite, Chair.
Not quite, okay.
The tariff was the price Gold Coast quoted the police.
Yeah,
So Gold Coast quoted the police 850 Rand a night. That's what the order was based on. They then charged 930 Rand, 39 Rand a night. So they charged at a higher rate per night than the approved order was for.
yes, okay.
So when I refer to an incorrect
So
tariff,
that is now even above their own quotation, as it were, tariff.
Correct, Chair.
Yeah, okay. And that is something that somebody working in Colonel Medu's section or unit, either Colonel Medu or somebody else, should have picked up.
Correct, Chair. That's the first step in
Yeah, to check.
approving a payment.
Yes, yes,
Is to vouch it back to your order.
yes. Would there have been so many instances like that one that one might be tempted to think that it was not negligence in terms of just the one where the tariffs are higher? I mean, we know based on what you are saying that even though we'll hear what they have to say, that it looks like it was a scheme. But that particular one would have thought that they would have said, no, but put it in accordance with the tariff that is on our records. If you do it above that tariff, I can't approve it because how will I justify approving it to my superiors?
Chair, that would be the common sense answer. But if one looks at this happened 10 years ago, nothing's happened to date.
But what I was asking was whether there may have been isolated instances where the Gold Coast claimed something even above their own tariff, or whether there were many such instances.
Chair, there were many.
There were many.
It wasn't just one or two where they did that.
Yeah.
Because to change the average by so much, you've got to do it almost
Yeah.
consistently.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Did you reach the conclusion that it's not a question that it wasn't picked up? It was accepted because that was part of the wrongdoing on the part of maybe Colonel Madu and whoever was working with him, or you did not go that far?
Chair, I didn't go that far.
Yeah, okay.
I felt that was the courts
Yeah,
to make that call.
yes. No, but from your own observation, there is a chance of being able to say, but there is no way how anybody, through negligence, cannot pick this up when it has happened so often. It's got to have been deliberate. There is a chance of saying, look, I'm not sure, maybe if they are too busy, maybe, it was negligence, okay, incompetence. That's what I was asking.
Chair, I didn't go that far.
Okay, all right. As you sit here, and you have had many years of reflecting on your report, if they were to say, in regard to those where Gold Coast charged even at a rate above their own tariff, if they were to say, no, it was oversight, would you be able to accept that kind of explanation?
No, Chair.
You would not.
No.
And that's partly because there were so many of them.
Yes, Chair, and it's an obvious step to normally take in approving an amount for payment, was you compare it back to what you ordered, and there would be a significant process to go through to now pay more than the order amount.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And Mr. White, do you believe that there reasonably could have been just more than 2 million rands worth of mistakes?
No, Chair. Chair, then scenario 3 is where I've calculated the difference between what was paid by Gold Coast to their supplier and the 850 Rand a price that they should have been supplying the police. So the difference between those two prices is just in excess of 12 million Rand. So Gold Coast made a profit up to the amount that the order was placed to them of 12.3 million Rand. They then overbilled by 2 million Rand above the amount of the order, and then in addition to that billed 4.9 million Rand for accommodation just not provided. So, Chair, you would, to calculate the prejudice, you would add all three together. Chair, but in the interest of being fair, when Gold Coast were negotiating with the police as a supplier, they said they don't own accommodation, they are an accommodation broker, and that they charge a 20% profit margin above what they purchase the accommodation at.
So if we can just stop there so that I can just show that to the Chair. You deal with Gold Coast's letter of the 22nd of October 2009 on page 197.
What's that page number again?
Page 197, Chair, in Exhibit RR4A.
197.
Yes, Chair. And this refers to Gold Coast's letter dated the 22nd of October 2009, which on the following page you say paragraph 2 of this letter is in response to paragraph 2 of SAPS letter, wherein the following is recorded. If you could just deal with that.
This was a document found in Gold Coast records by the police. And it says, amongst others, the order must be issued to Gold Coast Trading. Gold Coast Trading is a vendor for the SAPS with a vendor number and DC Annexure C. Please note that Gold Coast is in business of accommodation broking. We deal with various hotels in the Durban area. We have block booked hotels for the World Cup. This was done around in 2008. We are going to place approximately 20,000 people for this event. And with regard to paragraph 5, registration with the SAPS and vendor number, our company works on a profit margin of 20% gross. So, Chair, this is one document. The other documents that have been written to the police where they refer to themselves as making a 20% profit. So, Chair, just a couple of other points about this letter. In all the suppliers that were interviewed by the police that ultimately provided accommodation to Gold Coast, they said there was no block booked accommodation. So Gold Coast
And they
didn't have
exist. Did it exist before in 2008? Gold Coast.
Chair, to my recollection, Gold Coast had been around for a number of years.
Yeah, so it might have existed.
Yes.
Yes,
I think
but it did not make that block booking.
did not make the bookings.
Yes.
So to say they had bookings for 20,000 people, that was not true.
Yes.
Because all the suppliers they ultimately used to supply the police, none of them said it was pre-booked.
Yes.
Even in early of 2010, it was not pre-booked. So, Chair, if one allows them, the best case scenario for them, a 20% profit margin, and says, well, the police were told they were making a 20%.
But did they, when they gave a quotation before they were appointed, did they talk about this 20%?
They did in some of their documentation.
They did in some of their documentation.
Correct, Chair.
You're not talking about when they were sending invoices. I mean, when
No,
they
no.
were.
So before, when they were
Before.
providing quotations,
Yes.
in the April and the May before the World Cup,
Yes.
they said we
yes.
make a 20% margin.
Yes, but though the people who were to, that information was basically going to Colonel Medu.
Correct, Chair.
Yes, okay.
So, Chair, if one goes back to page 508, all I've done in scenario 4 is I've now assumed that the cost to Gold Coast is not, or the amount that could have been billed to the police should be Gold Coast's cost plus 20%. So in calculating a prejudice, it would either be scenario 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2, and 4. So that was just, if the argument they had was, we make it 20%, we've told you we do, well then the prejudice is 2 million less than it would have been, but it's still, it's either 17 million or 19 million. So that's the reason why I did that additional calculation, Chair.
And from your investigations, on average, what were you say were the profit margins being charged?
So, Chair, it was approximately on the goods that were provided, they were charging about 3 times the cost price. Chair, out of the total 47 million, they made approximately a 30 million rand profit.
About how much profit?
30.
30.
30.
Okay.
So, Chair, for 8 months of work, one customer, 30 million rand profit.
Yes. Do you have any idea about how Gold Coast was performing prior to this windfall?
No, Chair. I
You don't? Okay. Thank you.
Mr. White, you testified that you've done a number of investigations, you've appeared numerous times in court. On the basis of the available documentary evidence provided to you, what do you believe was the strength of the case against the suspects and the prospects of success?
Chair, based on my experience, the documentary evidence in this case is probably the strongest I've ever seen. The documents speak for themselves. And the suspects in the matter being primarily Mr. Pillai and his associates kept records of their wrongdoing. And those records can actually be traced back to what the police ultimately paid. And, Chair, this is a case that can be basically won on the documents. You almost don't need witnesses, but because of the fact that it was related to police corruption and fraud, the investigating officers went to great lengths, is probably the right word, to get statements from every possible witness. So every supplier that provided services, in whether it was the treadmill, whether it was accommodation, whether it was a Garmin or a generator, they obtained statements from each of those suppliers.
Well, I haven't read the report, your report, but I've seen some of the letters and correspondence, maybe memos, I'm not sure, that you wrote, particularly in regard to responding to some of the prosecutors' reasons for declining to prosecute. And they did seem to me, what you had to say seemed to be quite meticulous. It looks like you understood the evidence that was involved in this case very well. You went into details to deal with a lot of points that they raise. So yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start dealing with that now, Chair. Mr. White, was your report and findings sent to the investigators and the National Prosecuting Authority?
It was, Chair, and I referred to that at page 26 of my affidavit at RR4.
And who was the prosecutor assigned to the case?
Well, before you do that, before you go to that stage, I think you should take Mr. White through to the findings, if there are any findings in his report.
Yes, there are findings,
So
Chair.
that he can speak to those findings
Yes.
before we move further.
Yes, Chair, they are at the end of his report. They are his conclusions, which, Chair, you will find in file RR4A at page 503, right at the back of the file, Chair.
Yes.
Could you explain your findings to the Chair, please, Mr. White?
So, Chair, what I've summarised under the section of my report from page 503 through to page 510 is effectively a summary of most of what I've said to you.
What you have already said.
Chair.
Yeah.
Chair, maybe just one or two items that I haven't specifically covered. So if one goes to page 506.
I'll tell you what I'm looking for.
Yes, sorry, Chair.
I'm looking for evidence. I would like you to take each suspect, if you are able to, and say, this is the finding or conclusion I reached in regard to this finding. And if you are able to give the specifics. But if your report is not structured in that way, that's fine. You can deal with it in another way. Because you see, the real interest of the commission is twofold. One is whether there was corruption and fraud that took place, maybe threefold. Two, how that came about and who was to benefit or who was behind the whole thing. But also, was this case strong enough against the various suspects for this commission to justifiably say any prosecutor who declined to prosecute the suspects in the face of this evidence must have reached that conclusion because of something else, not because they were doing their job properly, and not because they were just mistaken, not because they just missed something, but because there was some other agenda. So that's why I want you to be able to speak to that in regard to each suspect, but it's possible that your report is not structured in such a way that it makes it easy for you to do it that way, in which case you can give me a picture in whatever way is convenient to you.
Chair, if I might be of assistance, in the body of the report, Mr. White he deals with each benefit obtained, and he makes a finding in his report in respect of every benefit. And
that's what I want.
And perhaps we can
So why don't we go there?
We can go there perhaps with some more detail now. Perhaps we could start, Mr. White. It's the benefit of the stay in the Protea Hotel on page 298 of the report. So if you went, just trying to see, let's start at page 295. I was going to the summary of the findings, but you can see there you deal with, you say gift to Captain Narain Spashat. You deal with the gift, the analysis of credit card statements,
Yeah, no.
and then the
Ms.
findings at page 298.
Ms. Wenzel, precisely what you are referring to at 295.
Yes,
I want him to talk about that.
Yes.
If you say Captain Naren Prasad was given a gift, and you talk around that, and then move on and deal with all the suspects, it may be, because I think that up to now, you might have mentioned that kind of thing only in passing. I just want to understand, and for whoever is listening or watching to understand, with regard to this suspect, this was the case against them. With regard to that one, this was the case. This is what they did wrong. This is how it happened, and so on. You already have somewhere you have talked about the benefit and the prejudice, benefit to the suspects, prejudice to SAPS, that kind of information. Is it going to be easy or is it difficult?
Chair, just need to try and, it will take some time because I just need to find the different references because I didn't prepare
You are not ready for that.
to provide that level of detail.
Okay, we can, are we finishing, we're not finishing today with him, are we finishing today with him?
no, Chair, he's going to testify, I think, the whole of tomorrow, Chair.
Yeah, so what we can do is tomorrow we can revisit this issue. I just want you to be able to say, with regard to Provincial Commissioner Ngobeni, this is what the investigation revealed she did wrong. This is what the police were charging her with. This is the conduct that was problematic. You go to Kendall Medu, you go to each one, and so that it's quite clear, because right now, up to now, one has an idea, but it needs to be told in a very clear and methodical way. In your report, it might come out like that, but so far it hasn't come out like that in oral evidence. You understand?
Chair, I do. It is in the report in different places. I will find the different references tonight.
So tomorrow you can then just deal with that. Take each one and deal with the case around them like that. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, would you like me to continue, or do you propose that we adjourn?
No, that aspect can be dealt with tomorrow. We still have him for tomorrow, and then after tomorrow it's Colonel Deploy. Okay, and then it's the aviation witnesses later in the week.
Yes, and Advocate Maniati, Chair, but that witness
that's
won't
a
be
short
too long.
one. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let's adjourn, because anyway we are at 5:04 now.
Yes, Chair.
And then we'll continue tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we adjourn.
All rise.